My name is Neil Peterson. I'm a cloud advocate with Azure, or with Microsoft, rather, working in Azure. This talk is titled Discover Azure Tooling and Utilities. Really appreciate you coming out. So I've got some slides here, but this is going to be a pretty demo-heavy session, and I'm excited about that. And really the goals of the talk are really just to introduce some tools that help support the deployment and management of solutions inside of Azure. Now, there's 4 tools or utilities that we're going to focus on for this session. That's command line tools like Azure CLI, PowerShell module for Azure, Visual Studio Code, Azure Cloud Shell, and Azure Resource Manager, particularly Azure Resource Manager templates. Now, that said, this is not a full list of the tools that are available for integrating, managing, deploying things in Azure. We've got a ton of tools available for us. Some open source tools like Terraform, Ansible. We've got great support in Azure for those. As well, we've got a great array of SDKs for Azure, such as Python, Go, Java, that allow us to interact with Azure kind of in the applications that we're building, or build our own tools to interact with Azure. So I just really wanted to call out quickly that this is not a full list. There is a ton of opportunity for deploying and managing and working with Azure across a whole ecosystem of tooling, but these are the ones that we're going to take a look at in this session. With that said, I'm going to jump straight in, get through a couple slides, and jump into some demos. First, talking about command line tooling. And as I go through this, I'm going to just call out, I work with all of these tools, and it can be a little confusing, like, wow, there's so many of them, and they do very similar things. So I'll put my own little personal spin on it, like why I choose to use one over the other in certain situations. And the first one we're going to talk about is the Azure CLI, or the Azure Command Line Interface. So Azure CLI is a cross-platform command line interface for provisioning, managing, pulling data, just really interacting with Azure. Now, there's been 2 versions of the Azure CLI. We're currently at version 2.0 point whatever. It updates quite frequently. And that's not as important as it was a couple years ago. But a couple years ago, we had a version 1, and it's very different than version 2. Version 2 is almost a complete rewrite in Python. It's an open source tool, so you can go read the code, you can contribute to the code, you can fix, spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes in the help if you want to. It's cross-platform, runs on Mac, Windows, Linux, as well Cloud Shell, which we're going to dig into in this session. And you can create and manage Azure resources basically from a command line. Not only that, but you can write bash scripts using the Azure CLI. So you can create full solutions that might do things like deploy several resources, pull some data back, configure those resources, and get them talking to each other. So it's a great environment for managing and interacting with Azure. So that's the Azure CLI. The next one is the PowerShell module for Azure. So if you've worked with PowerShell at all, this is just simply a module for Azure, a PowerShell module for Azure. Now, there are a couple little caveats or things to be aware of here. Just recently, within the last couple years, PowerShell Core has been released, which is a cross-platform version of PowerShell. You may notice that I'm working on a MacBook Pro here, and we'll be doing some PowerShell here, which we couldn't do a couple years ago. So that's pretty exciting. Now we have the ability, like if you love PowerShell, we now have the ability to work with PowerShell on a Mac, on Windows, in Linux. But because of that, we actually have 2 PowerShell modules for Azure. We have the PowerShell module for Windows, which is not the cross-platform one, and then we've got PowerShell Core module. So just something to take note of there. And again, using that cross-platform PowerShell module, we can run it on Windows, macOS, Linux. As well, we've got Docker images for it. And I should have mentioned this on the Azure CLI side as well. We've got Docker images. So if you've used Docker, this is actually pretty cool. I've run into situations where I'm working with the Azure CLI, or potentially PowerShell module as well, although I know this has happened with the Azure CLI, and like I know something used to work, and it's not quite working anymore. I'm able to actually pull down a Docker image of 2 versions of Go, test my commands there, and kind of validate like, oh wow, there's been some sort of code regression here, and I could go in and submit an issue for that code regression. So the ability to kind of go back in history and test these old versions of these CLI tools without actually installing them on my system using Docker is pretty cool. So that's PowerShell module for Azure. Now, I don't have specific demonstrations around the CLI in PowerShell. We're just going to kind of see those filtered throughout the rest of the session. The next tool we want to talk about is Visual Studio Code. So Visual Studio Code is a text editor. So if we're going to be writing Bash scripts or PowerShell scripts or whatever, we need to have a good text editor for that. However, Visual Studio Code is so much more than that. We can extend Visual Studio Code using extensions. We've got things like code linting. So if I'm writing PowerShell, the little squiggly lines that kind of indicate, hey, you might have an issue with your code right here. We've got a new feature. We demonstrated it in the opener this morning called Visual Studio Live Share. The ability to share the code that you're working on with somebody else, maybe in a remote site, and collaboratively code together on that piece of code. So lots of capabilities here beyond just a text editor. So what can I use it with? I mean, I live in Visual Studio Code. I spend most of my day in VS Code and can complete a good portion of what I do directly from VS Code. So we've got this little animation here, and you can see there's all kinds of things in there. But we've got plugins or extensions for Visual Studio Code for all of your major programming languages. So Go, Java, Node, PowerShell, Azure CLI, as well as some really creative things like spell checker. A large part of my job is writing documentation, and I write that directly in VS Code. Kind of embarrassing to admit, but a couple years ago, I would copy that documentation out of VS Code, drop it in Word, go find all my spelling mistakes, and then pull it back in, whereas there is a spell checking extension that I could just install in VS Code and do that directly from within VS Code. So, I mean, you can use it with all kinds of programming languages and environments that you want to work in. So, what are the benefits of using Visual Studio Code over maybe Notepad or Vim? So definitely a rich coding experience. And I mean, this is not, Visual Studio Code is not as heavyweight as Visual Studio, but you've got a lot of the same coding experience. And we're going to see this in the demonstration. So things like IntelliSense, the ability to, we've already talked about the linting, the ability to lint my Python project and see where it might have issues, as well as some other features that we'll see in the demonstration. So it really does provide an extremely rich coding experience in a very lightweight package. One tool, many jobs. Like I said, I can spend all day in Visual Studio Code. Maybe I'm writing some scripts, and then I want to interact with Azure using the Azure CLI. Visual Studio Code has a terminal built into it. So I can be writing my scripts up here, pop down to the terminal, run some commands to pull information from Azure or maybe delete something. And then maybe I need to go document what I'm working on. So without leaving Visual Studio Code, I can now write documentation in Markdown form. Not only can I write that documentation in Markdown form or whatever form, I can also render and see what my Markdown is going to look like directly inside of Visual Studio Code. So one tool, many jobs. Got a little bit of animation there, but we'll do a better job than that in our demonstration. Customizable. So I've already kind of mentioned extensions. There's a ton available. And again, it's not just things like linting code and attaching to programming languages. There's some really intense integrations built in, or some extensions available for VS Code. One of the ones that we use at Microsoft is called Acrolinks. I don't have it set up, so I won't be able to demonstrate it. but it's kind of like Grammarly. It's not just like linting my code. It's actually another little program that lives inside of Visual Studio Code that I execute by adding this extension. So super duper customizable and extensible. I think the next tab is actually extensible. So the customizable piece is, if you want to set your column widths a certain way, we can do that. We've got themes for VS Code. You'll see up here in some of these animations, it's in a dark theme. I've switched mine to a light theme because it's easier to read in a room like this. So rich coding experience, one tool for many jobs, customizable, and super extensible through these plugins. So that said, I'm going to jump straight into the demonstration. And there's quite a bit going on in this demo, so it should be fun. Now, one of the things I'm going to do, because I do have a bunch of steps here, I've created a little file for myself that I'm going to work through, and I just happen to have that file open in VS Code. So before we kind of get into some of the cool features, just to give a quick tour of how VS Code is laid out. Over here, we've got the activity bar. And this is where you can do things like, I can open up a directory of files. Like if I'm working on a huge code base, instead of opening up an individual file, I can open up that whole directory. And maybe I want to find every file that has an instance of a string or a word. I can search that whole code base right here. I can explore all those files. We're going to see here in a minute that we've got debugging capabilities here. But as well, look at this. This is a Kubernetes icon. So I've got a Kubernetes extension installed in VS Code, and that extension drops an icon on my activity bar over here. So the next piece is the editor pane, which is what we're looking at right here. And this is just simply our text editor. And then finally, we've got this panel down here with a couple other solutions. So like debugging console we'll see here in a little bit. But here we got that terminal that I talked about. So directly inside of this tool, I can do things like list the files on the drive, or maybe I want to just quickly see a list of all the VMs in my Azure subscription. I can do something like azvm list output table, which is just running an Azure CLI command to return a list of virtual machines from my environment. So I'm coding, I need a list of VMs, I can just pop down here, run a command really quickly without leaving the tool. I think that's pretty cool. So that said, let's get into something a little more full-featured and take a look at an actual coding experience in Visual Studio Code. So I've just got a simple little hello world application here. And let's just start by looking at IntelliSense. So I'm just going to come in here, and I've got this package. This is a Node app. I've got this package Figlet installed, but I don't know a whole lot about it. So I'm just going to type in Fig. And you can see right away, it's kind of prompting me like, hey, we see that you've got this package Figlet installed. We're going to, kind of auto-complete this for you, or give you the option to auto-complete this. OK, that's neat. But then what can I do with this package? So I'm going to hit a dot, and now we can see all the methods and properties that are available for this package here. So let's go ahead and I'll click on Apply. Now maybe I want to know more about this apply method. I can actually hover over it, get some information about it, like see some of the code behind. Maybe I actually want to dig into the code that is this apply method. I can right-click on this, go to definition, and see the code behind on this method. So again, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that while we do have a very lightweight text editor here, this is like a full-featured coding experience. All right, so let me go ahead and pull that out of there. Let's look at debugging. So I'm going to go ahead and let me just close this file out without saving it, just to make sure I didn't mess anything up. So I'm going to go ahead and set a breakpoint right here on line 9. Actually, I'll set it on line 8. Now we can see over here I've got this debug icon. I'm going to go ahead and click that and click Run. Just exit out of that. And you can see my debug console that it's saying, hey, server listening on port 3000. So let me go ahead and open up a browser. Type in, whoop. Did Did I hit that? Yep. And I think it just hit that breakpoint. And so now if I expand, so once I've hit a breakpoint, I want to investigate, what are all my variables set to? What's actually going on at this point? I can actually scroll down here, and let's find message. And we can see there, hello, Amsterdam, which if we look at line 7, that's exactly what we've put in there. So full debugging experience. I'll go ahead and continue on here and see what happens. I don't know why it's not hitting that code. Let's try that again without the breakpoint in there. And there we go. So I'm also able to run this application directly from Visual Studio Code on my local system. All right. So that's some of the, the features around coding. Let me go ahead and kill my debugger here. We can do some other pretty cool things here. I mean, some things that I use day to day is if I'm working on a big code base and maybe I want to compare 2 files. Now, this doesn't work as great on a small little monitor like this, but if I've got, at my home setup, I can actually split this screen. And maybe I wanted to open up that application we were just looking at over here, have another panel over here, and then I can kind of work side by side on 2 files at one time. And then I talked about extensions. So we've got extensions for all kinds of things, and we've got an Azure extension that allows us to do things like deploy our code directly from VS Code. So I've actually got this Azure extension installed and connected to my Azure subscription. So what I want to do now is I actually want to deploy this application from VS Code without running any commands, without opening up the Azure portal, just directly from VS Code using the extension that's installed. So on my machine here, I'm hitting function F1. And you can see that it's already prompted me with some of the Azure, the capabilities that this extension has added to Visual Studio Code, such as create a new web app service. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that, enter a globally unique name. And actually, before I do this, let me just pull up my portal. And we can just see what's there right now. So I just hit refresh. So I'm going to go ahead and do, let's do AMS demo 001. And it's going to kind of walk me through a little wizard here that's going to help me deploy this application directly from Visual Studio Code into my Azure subscription. So if I come over here now and refresh this, we can see that a resource group was created, and we're creating an app service plan. At some point, it's going to come back and ask me, all right, we've got your app service plan created. Now, what files do you want to deploy to that app service plan? I can then go in and browse to the folder and deploy this out as well. Now, one note, though, let me just kick this off before I catch the note. Yep, so I want to go ahead and deploy an app. I can browse for my app. I'll just grab this Hello World directory right here, click Open, finish out this wizard. And if we come over here in just one moment, there it is. We can see that the application is now being deployed from Visual Studio Code. So one of the things that I like to call out here, though, is that, yeah, this extension is pretty cool, but I'm also relatively comfortable on the command line. We've talked about Azure CLI. We've talked about PowerShell. I could also do this stuff directly down here in this terminal if I wanted to. This thing takes a moment to deploy, so let's talk about some other things here. I talked about documentation and Markdown. I mean, it's kind of a simple little demo, but I think it's pretty cool. Like I said, my job involves writing lots of documentation. So I've got a simple little Markdown file here, just some text and an image. And I can actually preview this Markdown file. I can render this Markdown file directly in VS Code before pushing it to GitHub or wherever I want my the consumers of this file to consume it at. So we got this little icon here, and I can do it. And we can see, yep, I got a H1 here, just indicated by the one bang, and I can see my heading and some simple text. However, my image there is not rendering. So right away, I know that I've got an issue with my Markdown itself, and in real time, I can go and fix this issue, which I just had an additional dot there, remove that in the Markdown file, and I can see that rendered up in the other pane. So I think that's pretty cool. I talked about some of the external extensions that we use at Microsoft. So this is the Acrolinks one right here. I don't have it hooked up, but what you can see here is that we've actually have like a little application inside of Visual Studio Code now. So it's not just linting and things that we perform on the text files themselves. And then finally, Git integration. So you can see over here, I've made a couple changes, and this is a GitHub repository. I've cloned down a repo, and I'm working directly inside of that repo. Visual Studio Code itself has been able to determine, like, hey, this is a Git repo, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of light this up. And we can see right here that I've actually made 2 changes. These are full file changes. But so, for instance, if I was to come into my Markdown file, and let me just make a basic edit here. Save that. We can see over here that we've got 3 changes, and I can actually go inside Visual Studio Code, and I do this quite often. Like, I'll be coding away, and it's like, I'm ready to commit, but like, I don't even remember what I did. I can use this feature to go and kind of compare the file changes, and then I can do things like, if I'm not down with that feature, I can revert it right from here. I could commit this code directly from here, and then push it up to GitHub or wherever my source control system is. But again, same with deploy, like as the example where I deploy the application, I'm comfortable on the command line, I can do the same thing down here. Oop. Ugh. So I can see status, I can commit, I can push directly from the terminal. So it looks like that application successfully deployed. Let's just go ahead and take a look at it. So we can see that it's running. And if I was to browse to this, we should see the same application that I saw locally. So developed it locally, deployed it directly from VS Code. All right. And that just about does it. I already showed the command to return a list of VMs. So az VM list, table. And I can do all kinds of things from here. Like if I wanted to take a look at my resource groups, and maybe I wanted to delete one of those. In fact, let's go ahead and do it. I can do az group delete name. I'll just delete that web app that we just deployed. Yes, indicating like, yes, I'm sure that I want to do this. And then no wait, just so that it doesn't sit here and spin while it deletes. So that's pretty cool. We've already seen some of that, but I think what's even more cool, or as cool, is PowerShell integration. So I'm going to go ahead and start a PowerShell session. PWSH. And so here I am on my Macintosh in Visual Studio Code. I was running Azure CLI commands. I'm now running PowerShell, and I can do something like git az VM and return a list of VMs that way using PowerShell as well. So I think that's pretty slick. All right, so that was a quick tour of Visual Studio Code, PowerShell, Azure CLI, some of the integration capabilities. I mean, I obviously just ran 2 little Azure CLI commands there. And we've got great documentation on all of our Azure CLI commands, PowerShell commands, as well. That documentation's available directly in the tool itself. So something like az VM create -- help or git help git -az VM. We'll pull that documentation up as well. So let's jump back into the deck real quick. So Azure Cloud Shell. Is anybody using Azure Cloud Shell? OK, a couple hands. So this is cool. So what Azure Cloud Shell is just basically a shell or a terminal built into a browser. It comes preloaded with a bunch of tools, so Azure CLI, PowerShell module, including things like Terraform and Docker. It does some cool things like auto-authentication. So I open up a browser, I open up the Azure portal, I can launch Cloud Shell directly from the portal. And what we didn't see when I was using VS Code is that like when I first installed the Azure CLI, I had to log into Azure. Or when I first installed the PowerShell module, I had to log into Azure. With Cloud Shell, it just assumes the identity that you've authenticated with Azure inside that browser. It just assumes that identity and kind of passes through that authentication. So there's some auto-authentication capabilities here as well. We got private and secure environments. It's literally a terminal in the browser, but you can do things like create files and create directories and store stuff. And that stuff is actually stored in an Azure storage account, which is encrypted at rest. It's your account. You control it. You control the security around it. And then, like I said, we've got a bunch of tools pre-installed in Cloud Shell. There's just a couple of them, but it's huge. And one of the neat things about about Cloud Shell is that these tools are all kept up to date automatically, meaning that the Cloud Shell itself is revisioned quite often. So, like as we're updating the Azure CLI, which happens really often. I mean, the Azure CLI gets updated quite often. We're automatically updating that in Cloud Shell as well. So another one of these situations where like, hey, something's not working, and this is something I do all the time, something's not working on my machine. Is perhaps my Azure CLI out of date? I can quickly open up Cloud Shell, do like an AZ -- version to see the version number of the CLI, compare that to what I have, and like, yep, okay, mine is out of date. Now, is what I'm trying to do, does it work in Cloud Shell? And I can kind of validate that. So it's just a nice environment, lots of tools, always up to date. I've mentioned, and we're going to see all of this in demonstration, I've mentioned that you can open this up directly from the Azure portal, but we'll see it in other places as well. So docs.microsoft.com is our new documentation platform. I say new, it's a couple years old now, but we're all really proud of it. It still feels fresh and new. But we've actually got Cloud Shell integration directly into our documentation now. So you've got a document with commands to run, you hit a button, it opens up Cloud Shell in the document, you can copy and paste the commands, and you're running these commands in your Azure subscription. So it's a slick integration. As well, we can actually pipe Cloud Shell directly through to Visual Studio Code so that I can take advantage of some of those pre-installed tools and whatnot. So that said, let's take a demo. Let's see a demo of Cloud Shell in action. All right, so here I am at the Azure portal. I'm just going to kind of clean stuff up here. And we can see up here I've got this little icon that looks command line-ish. So I'll just go ahead and click on that and see what's going on here. And that's opening up Cloud Shell for me. Takes a moment, so we're actually spinning up a little environment that hosts this Cloud Shell in Azure itself. Attaching that storage account. So we didn't see it here, but the very first time you launch Cloud Shell, it's going to prompt you like to create a storage account. And it's this storage account where your files are created. And I'll get into that in a little bit more because you can kind of shoot yourself in the foot or make some mistakes if you're not aware of how Cloud Shell is arranged. I can do like, I like working in this view, particularly when I've got a large monitor, because I can do stuff like, make some changes. And sometimes I just want to visually inspect if those changes have been made. Like maybe I delete a resource group. I can delete that from Cloud Shell. I can then just pop up and refresh the portal and see if my changes have really filtered through. But maybe sometimes you want it full screen. So you can just hit that button of full screen. And you can also just browse to shell.azure.com and just automatically get that full screen version of Cloud Shell. Now, so like, what are the limitations here? Like, okay, you've got a terminal in a browser. Like, certainly there's no file system there, or certainly I can't create things. But it's quite the contrary. So I can run a command like ls and see the contents of the directory that I'm in. Maybe I want to do touch test.txt to create a file. Now do ls again. So I've just created a file. Maybe I want to add text to that file. We'll see a couple different ways that we can do that. What I want to do, though, right now is call out this cloud drive right here. So I just created a file at the root of Cloud Shell. And I said this earlier, when we launch Cloud Shell, we're spinning up a little environment for you to host this terminal. I've created test.txt right there at the root, but there is no assurance that that file will be there the next time that I open up Cloud Shell. Because these environments, when I close Cloud Shell, at some point these environments get cleaned up. So to ensure like data consistency and ensure that I have access to the files that I need in Cloud Shell all the time, I want to make sure that I'm working in Cloud Drive. So I'll just change directories into Cloud Drive. And Cloud Drive represents that Azure storage account that will always be there when you open up Cloud Shell. So we destroy your environment, but we don't touch your storage account. Next time you open up Cloud Shell, we reattach that storage account to Cloud Shell. So just that's the caveat. Make sure you're working inside of Cloud Drive. So I talked about tool integration. So let's just do AZ VM list. Output table. We've already run this a couple times. There's my VMs. Now I can actually switch this to PowerShell if I wanted to. At one point, there was two different, prior to having the .NET Core or the cross-platform version of PowerShell, we actually had a distinct PowerShell in Bash environment. But now that I've got cross-plat on PowerShell, I can just type in pwsh. Now I'm working in PowerShell, and I can run my PowerShell commands if I want to. And you can see there it's going through that process of authenticating me to Azure. I won't do anything there. But we've got other things in here as well. So like, I'll just run the command docker. You can see that I've got the Docker CLI installed here, or Terraform. Same thing, and I use Terraform inside of Cloud Shell all the time. Or Git. So this is something I do as well. Like, hey, I need to work in Cloud Shell, but I've got all my files in source code. I can just pop in here, clone a repo down, and boom, I've got access to my files. In fact, I have a repo here. It's the same one that I've got open in Cloud Shell. Let me just navigate to a directory here real quick. Let's see what we've got inside of here. So I've got two scripts in here. I've got a PowerShell script. Oh, and I apologize. That's a little hard to read up there. Let me go ahead and bump this text size up. That's about the best I can do inside of the browser here. For the rest of the time that we spend in here, I'll do a better job of describing what I'm doing here. But I've got two files in this directory. I've got a PowerShell script and a Bash script. Now, just like any terminal, I can do something like cat ACI. If I want to see the contents of, let's just take that PowerShell script. That works great. I can also do, like, maybe I want to edit that script. We've got tools in here like Vim and Nano. So nano ACI.ps1. So now I've got a little text editor here. But I think we can, in my opinion, do a little bit better than that. And we've got a text editor in here that has a look and feel very similar to Visual Studio Code. So I'm just going to type in code, space, and then a dot to just open up the directory that we're currently in. And I know that's like just super difficult to see. But over here under files, I've got a list of both of the files that are in that directory. I can click on one, so I'll just do ACI.ps1. And notice here that I've got mouse control. I can search for text. I can find and replace. It's not true Visual Studio Code. We don't have like the ability to add extensions here, but it's a darn good text editor inside of the browser, inside of this terminal, and it allows me to work on like big groups of files versus kind of like opening one in Vim, closing it, opening another in Vim. And then finally, we've also got this terminal down here very similar to VS Code. So let me just go ahead and I'm just going to run like sh ACI.sh, which is just a simple little shell script that creates a resource group and then creates an Azure Container Instance in that resource group and then echoes out the IP address of the Azure Container Instance. So again, just kind of reiterating the obvious, but I think it's so cool that it's worth reiterating. I'm inside of a browser, working inside of a text editor, a full-featured text editor with a terminal deploying a script that I have written right there. Everything stored in a storage account so that anywhere I go, I can open up this browser and get back to it. We even have an application for phones that allows me to do the same thing directly on my phone. So that's pretty cool. My container instance was deployed. I've got the IP address there just for the sake of completeness. Go ahead and browse to the container instance, and it's up and running, and my application's functional at this point. So that's Cloud Shell. Let me make sure there's nothing else I wanted to get into there. Oh, yeah. I think this is also worth mentioning or taking a look at. So I've just browsed to docs.microsoft.com. If you've not worked with docs.microsoft.com, particularly if you've had like a bad experience with Microsoft documentation in the past, I would ask you, please, please, please go check this out. We've put a ton of effort into not only the quality of our docs, but the platform that the docs are on. So I'm just going to navigate to a doc set that I know well, and this is our Kubernetes documentation. And so you can see here we've got documentation, we've got images embedded inside of it, but then we get to some commands here. First command being to create a resource group. I can actually click this try it button, and you can see what's happening is we're opening up Cloud Shell directly inside of this document. And I'm not going to go through the little wizard there, but once I configure this, I will have a Cloud Shell environment side by side with my documentation, and I can run these commands as I'm learning, as I'm reading the documentation. Something else worth calling out here, and I'm kind of stealing this thunder from the last couple slides in my deck, but that's OK. We also have a new platform called Learn. If you go to docs.microsoft.com, we've got this button up here, Start Learning. This is a training platform similar to documentation, but more of kind of like guided training. It also has Cloud Shell integration, but one of the unique things about Learn is that when you start that Cloud Shell session, it's not using your Azure subscription. We're actually using what we call a sandboxed environment. So you can come to Learn and run through a Kubernetes tutorial. Actually, no, we don't have a Kubernetes tutorial yet. Run through an Azure VMs tutorial, or run through an Azure Container Instances tutorial. Run the commands in Cloud Shell, but you don't have to have your own Azure subscription. You don't have to bring a credit card. You don't have to sign up for a trial. We just set up a little sandbox environment for you. Now, obviously, once you're done, those resources are no longer available to you, but it's a neat learning experience with that Cloud Shell integrated into it. So that's Cloud Shell. The last thing I want to talk about, and the last big topic, is Azure Resource Manager templates. So we've talked a lot about the Azure CLI and PowerShell for deploying and managing resources. But I'm of the opinion that at a certain point, we can kind of like up-level the sophistication of how we deploy resources. You may have heard the term like infrastructure as code. That's what we would consider our Azure Resource Manager template solution. So rather than writing scripts, like if you think about it, if I'm writing a script to deploy a VM, I need to do things like, before I deploy the VM, I want to make sure that a VM doesn't already exist that has the same name. Because if I don't check for that in my script's going to like bomb out on me. It's going to throw an error, which might be acceptable. But ideally, we want to like, hey, does this VM exist? If it does, elegantly state, hey, the VM exists. I'm going to exit now. If it doesn't exist, go ahead and create it. So when you're scripting, there's a lot of this overhead that you need to do. As well, let's say I wrote a script to deploy 17 VMs and a bunch of networking stuff, and then I need to tweak one setting. If I wanted to do that using my script, it would be up to me to build all that logic to determine, like, OK, all of these 17 VMs exist, and all the networking stuff is there. We just need to go change this one thing. And that can become pretty heavy duty if you're scripting that stuff yourself. When we kind of shift to looking at infrastructure as code, things like Azure Resource Manager templates, Terraform would be another example here as well. The solutions, the infrastructure as code solutions, take care of a lot of that heavy scripting logic for us. So what an Azure Resource Manager template is it's a JSON document where I declare the resources that I want to deploy into my Azure environment. I declare the configuration. So what is the VM name? What is the networking configuration on that? Now, JSON's not super duper easy to write, but when you look at it, you're really just declaring the things that you want to deploy. And then I take this JSON document and I can deploy it to Azure. Now, if I wanted to do something like update a networking piece, I can just go in and update the networking piece and then redeploy that template. So without myself having to write all the logic to make sure that things work themselves out, that's built into the Azure Resource Manager template solution. So we can redeploy these templates time after time, and the solution will figure out the pieces that need to be updated and whatnot. As well, we can do lots of slick things like, I'll show an example here, like build an Azure Resource Manager template, store it in GitHub, and then create a little button that says deploy to Azure. You click that button, and we're now deploying that template to Azure. So there's a couple cool little tricks you can do with it. And I've kind of already gone through some of these benefits, some of them at least. So repeatedly deploy your solutions. I'm giving a talk tomorrow, Hybrid 30, around managing your Azure infrastructure. And it's got this huge demo environment. 10 VMs. In fact, it's the 10 VMs that we saw when I did the Git VM. 10 VMs, an Azure automation account, a bunch of scripts, tons of configuration. I mean, tons of configuration. And I have that all built into an Azure Resource Manager template. And literally, before I got on the plane to come out here to Amsterdam, I just ran that template, jumped on the plane, and I had the assurance that that environment was going to be deployed and configured exactly the way that I need it when I get here. Define dependencies, apply access control, and apply tags to resources. That second bullet point there is the declarative template. Again, we're declaring our infrastructure as opposed to writing scripts to do it for us. Now, I already kind of mentioned it. I mean, JSON's not super duper easy to read, but there are a couple different sections to an Azure Resource Manager template. I just want to kind of call out some of the terminology right now, and then we'll jump into an example template and kind of walk through some of these. So I've already described it's a JSON document, and then within this document, we really have 4 sections. We've got parameters, variables, resources, and output. What parameters are is, think of these as the things that I need a user or a system to input into my deployment. So an example might be a virtual machine name. Rather than hard coding that in my template, I want to make that a parameter. So every time I deploy that template, somebody can enter that VM name. The second one is variables. You might say to yourself, man, that sounds like a variable. Like what you just described sounds like a variable. And parameters and variables are used very similarly. The difference is a variable, we don't have the opportunity to input data. A variable is just built into the Resource Manager template. Maybe you've got a connection string. You don't want a user to input that, but you want the ability, if that connection string changes, rather than having to go through my big Azure Resource Manager template and change it in the 10 places that we have it, just change the variable. And we'll see an example of that in the demonstration. The third kind of section of the Resource Manager template is the resources, and this is where we actually get into defining the resources that we want to deploy. Virtual machines, networking stuff, Azure Kubernetes cluster, whatever it may be. And we can get really big with these templates. Like I just described, I have one that I use for a session tomorrow, and it's got tons of resources in it. So this isn't just I need to create a VM thing. This is I need to deploy a solution. We can not only just deploy resources with these templates, we can deploy resources and then bring in our applications, configure everything so that when we're done, we've got full working applications. And then finally, we've got an output section. At its most basic form, the output will output to the screen. So you can do things like maybe I deployed a Azure Container Instance, and I want to output the FQDN for the application. I can do that. But we also use outputs when we chain templates together. So we can build multiple templates and kind of modularize the work that we're doing with those templates and chain them together. And we would use the output section of a template to take output from one template and feed it into another template. We also have the ability, and like I said, I've kind of said this a couple times, JSON's not super duper human readable. I mean, it's not the best environment to write by hand. So we've got a couple little helper things to kind of help you through it. And basically what we have is the ability to export existing resources into a template. So on this little screenshot here, basically we're looking at a container instance inside of the Azure portal. And I've got this automation script button. I can click on that, and what it's going to do is take either the single resource or all the resources in the resource group and export these to a template that I can then redeploy. Now, just in full transparency, this works really great on like a single resource or a couple of resources. But if you have like a resource group that's got like 100 resources in it and you go run this, it's going to spit out a template for sure. But it's kind of like it does its best to format that template the best it can. But when you have a bunch of resources, it comes out pretty big and nasty. Now, it is still helpful though. Like if you have like a property that you need to set and you're working on your template and like you're like, man, I just can't quite get the format here right. You can go through this process, even if you don't intend on redeploying that template, just to kind of see an example. As well, we've got the template structure, the JSON schema, fully documented for all of our Azure resources. So that said, let's jump into the last demo here, where we're going to look at Azure Resource Manager templates. And I know that was quite a bit, and I called out a bunch of stuff. I'm going to re-go over all those sections, and we'll just kind of take a look at what a template looks like and kind of reiterate a couple of things that we just talked about. So what I have here is just a basic Azure Resource Manager template that deploys an Azure container instance. Now, the Azure container instance piece doesn't really matter here. I just chose it because it deploys fast. It's a single little resource that has a fully functioning application in it. Like I talked about, we've got 4 sections to this template, or to any Azure Resource Manager template. The first one is parameters. So we can see here I've got a parameter of name, a description, a default value. I've got another one of image, port, CPU cores, quite a few parameters here. And we'll see how these work here in just a second. We can also see here that I've got no variables defined. We're going to change that in just one moment. Third section is resources. And here's where we can actually see the resources that we're deploying. So for instance, here's my Microsoft.container instances container group. So this is an Azure container instance resource. And you can see in here all of the configuration for that resource. And yeah, it's not super duper pretty, but it works. I said that we've got all of this documented, and what I meant by that is like the actual schema. Like, so if I want to deploy an Azure container resource, and I don't know like all of the properties that I can include in it, if you just do a search for like Azure Resource Manager templates, virtual machine, or storage account, you should pretty easily be able to find the document where we've got an example of what the JSON will look like. And then for every property, we've got a definition of what those properties are, what data type it needs, acceptable values, et cetera. So we've put a lot of work into trying to document these. And this is an ongoing process. I mean, we all know that JSON, not super duper human readable or writable. We've got ongoing things to really improve the experience around Azure Resource Manager templates. And then finally, we've got outputs, which here I'm outputting the IP address of the container instance. Now, we've got several different ways that I could deploy this. I can use a VS Code extension. I can use Azure CLI or PowerShell from this terminal. But we've got this one that I actually use quite a bit. I like it. To me, it's a good way to test. Like, did I format my template correctly? Do I have the right parameters in place? And I don't think it's very widely known. And this is, we can actually deploy these templates directly from the Azure portal. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all of that out. I am going to close out Cloud Shell. I don't need that anymore. And now here I am in the Azure portal. I'm going to click on Create a Resource. And then I'm just going to search for template. And we can see I've got an option here for template deployment. I'll click on that and just click Create. And then it's got a couple little pre-baked templates if I want to start from like a VM or SQL database or a web app. Whoop, that's not what I wanted to do. What I want to do is this option here, build your own template in the editor. So we've got this another code editor inside of the portal, and I can just take out this boilerplate stuff that's there and paste in my template. And so right away, we've got some little UI coolness happening here. I can see a list of all my parameters. I've got no variables, and I've got the one resource, which is the Azure Container Instance. So that looks good to me. So I'm just going to hit this button, Save, which then allows me to deploy this. I can create a new resource group right here. But what I think is really cool is this settings piece right here. So here's those parameters that I have defined in the template. And this is my ability to add values. Now, I have default values for most of these, so I could just hit go and go with these values. But if I wanted to alter one of those here, I could. Now, if I was deploying this with the Azure CLI or PowerShell or some other tool, I would just define these parameters on the command line or whatever kind of script that I'm using to deploy those. But as I'm looking at this, I see this location one here. And what this is doing, this is actually a function within the template that just takes the resource group that template is being deployed to. I don't really need that as a parameter. Like, I don't need any input here. So I'm actually going to go back over to my template here and move. I'm just going to create a new variable. So I'm going to come in and find the location parameter. I'm going to grab the value of it. And instead of a parameter, I'm going to create a variable. And I'm doing this to kind of show how variables and parameters work throughout a template, because they're very similar in how they work. And so I'm just going to give this a value of, or a name of location, and a value of this. I don't think, maybe I don't need these quotation marks. Oh, yeah, I do. Oh, you know what I bet is going on? So I've got some linting there. I'm hovering over that. It's basically stating that the variable location is not used. So this is proper, but we're not using it anywhere in the template. What I'm going to do now is delete this parameter. And go ahead and delete that comma. And now if I search my Resource Manager template for location, you can see I'm actually using this value right here on line 37. And we can see location equals parameters location. So it's no longer a parameter, it's a variable. So I'm actually going to flip that to variable. I'm going to go ahead and spell that right. And so that easily, I was able to flip that from a parameter to a variable. So let me just copy this out. We'll go back over to my portal. This does not look good to me anymore. I want to redo this. Template deployment, build my own template in the editor, drop that in there. So now you can see we've got the one variable. If I click save, we can see that I am no longer asked for my location. I can agree to this. Oh, I need to create a new resource group. Boom, it's going to take that template and deploy the resources that were defined inside of that template. Last thing I want to show is kind of that export feature. So I'm going to go to my resource group. Let me just find something in here simple. So I've got this resource group here, line of business app. And I've got a container. Oh, let's do this one. I've got this Azure Cosmos DB right here. I'm going to click on that. And then I have got this export template feature right here. I will click on that. And you can see it spits out a template here that I can now copy and paste that out and kind of investigate, like, okay, how is an Azure Cosmos database formatted inside of a template? Maybe it's good. Maybe I just copy this out and change a couple values, and I now have the template that I'm going to use to deploy Azure Cosmos databases. Cool. So I love Azure Resource Manager templates, write them all the time, use them all the time. And I hope that was helpful. Let's jump back into the PowerPoint presentation and wrap this up. So we went through a whole bunch of tech. And like I called out as we came into the session, there's a whole bunch of other things. I mean, we got Terraform, we've got Ansible, we've got SDKs. But these are the big ones that we wanted to talk about in this session. We've got documentation for all of these. We've actually looked at some of this documentation. We've got Cloud Shell built into our documentation so that you can experience all of this directly inside of the browser. You can grab the PowerPoint deck and even the code that was demonstrated here. Not that there's a whole lot at these links. I've really enjoyed it. Please fill out your evaluations. I hope this was helpful. We do have a couple minutes here if you want to run up and ask some questions. I'll also be at the Ask the Experts booth throughout tomorrow. I appreciate you coming out. Thanks a lot.